Okay, good morning, everybody, and happy World Mental Health Day. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. My name's Kerry Anthony, and I'm the Chief Executive of Inspire. A lot of you will probably know quite a bit about Inspire, but we're one of the leading mental health charities working here in Northern Ireland. But we also deliver services around intellectual disability, autism, and addictions right across the island of Ireland. So we're really delighted today to have our panelists with us to talk a little bit about mental health, because as we know, mental health has no borders and impacts on every aspect of life. So as part of World Mental Health Day, we at Inspire are delighted to be hosting a series of online events, the Wellbeing sessions, and to celebrate and focus on the 5 steps to wellbeing. So those are being active, connecting, giving, keeping learning, and taking notice. And some of you might have tuned in this morning at 9 a.m. for Christine Green's morning Be Active yoga session, which took place at Inspire's Community Wellbeing Service at Aspen in Finnegy, South Belfast. And that was a gentle start and stretch to the day ahead. The aim of today's session is to discuss how we connect with those around us. How does connection across various communities contribute to the maintenance of good mental health? Also, how do we keep the Act Being Kind movement, which continues to foster such community spirit, how do we keep that alive? So I'm joined today by a wonderful panel of experts, people who've got significant experience in this area, both here in Northern Ireland and further afield. And so rather than me introducing, I'm going to ask each of the panel members to introduce themselves and say where they come from and a little bit about themselves. So Siobhan, we'll start with you if that's okay.
Hello, good morning. Yes, so my name is Siobhan O'Neill. I'm a professor at Ulster University, and I've recently taken on the role of interim mental health champion for Northern Ireland, working with government to shape policy and being the voice of the people. Thanks for having me here.
Lovely to have you, Siobhan, and congratulations on the appointment. Dwayne, yourself?
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. My name is Dwayne Farrell, and I'm Chief Executive with Relate NI. And I suppose our role in this is the fact that relationships are an essential and fundamental foundation to our mental health and well-being. And while Relate's probably best known for our work with couples, actually what we do is far wider. We work with children, young people, families. So looking forward to a really good conversation today. Thank you, Kerry.
Lovely, Dwayne. Thanks for joining us. Karen, a more familiar face to myself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Mcquarrie. I'm one of the Assistant Directors for Mental Health Services within Inspire. So yes, Kerry knows me well. And my remit within Mental Health Services is really across the board, both in housing services, floating sports services and community wellbeing services. And what we're discussing today is very pertinent to all of those services and how we develop compassion and kindness throughout what we do on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks, Karen. Joanne, how yourself?
Hi, thanks, Kerry. Hello, everybody. My name is Joanne Morgan, and I'm Director of Community Development and Health Network. We're a membership organisation. We work all across Northern Ireland. And the focus of our work is reducing health inequalities through community development. We think community development is one of the best ways to understand the issues and the factors that affect people's health and well-being, and then help facilitate people themselves to come together as collectives to take the most appropriate action. So we're delighted to be involved in this.
Lovely, Joanne, thank you. And Maura, yourself?
Hi, thanks Kerry for having me this morning. So my name is Maura McMenamin and I'm Community and Health Manager with Ulster GA. So Ulster GA has within the last 5 years or so taken on a real proactive approach to promoting health and wellbeing within the club. So I would be responsible for coordinating a lot of that work in Ulster. So delighted to be here this morning.
That's lovely, thank you. You're all very, very welcome, and I'm just going to facilitate a little bit of a conversation and bring each of you in. It's a bit more challenging. We're all getting used to this world where we don't get to see all of the full body language, so I'll try to bring everybody in as we go along. So obviously the issue of self-care is incredibly important, and I suppose certainly given the pressures and strains of the current environment that we find ourselves in, people may find themselves isolated. They're feeling reduced personal, professional contacts, maybe those contacts feel like they're shrinking a little bit. But community care remains a really important factor in how we can promote the idea of well-being for all. So I'd like to take a chance now to ask the panel about community care, especially in the context of the current public health situation. Dwayne, I'll maybe come to you first and ask you a little bit about what Relate NI are doing in this area, and what are the challenges and opportunities that you are seeing in your work?
Sorry, Kerry, thank you. Absolutely, community care is an essential element of how we can work with and support people. And particularly, I think lockdown has been such an intense experience for individuals, for families, for communities. So self-care can take us some of the way there, absolutely, but actually access to support is an essential foundation for people moving forward. At Relate NI, as with most of the rest of the sector, we frantically moved to transition all of our services to webcam and to telephone. And to ensure, I suppose what we realized quite early on was the specifics of lockdown. People were going to be working from home, children weren't going to have access to school, childcare was going to be an issue, financial worries were going to be an issue for people, and that they were all issues that really had the potential to have an impact on the quality of relationships for individuals and for families. So actually we felt it was going to be more of a need for our services over the lockdown period. So we made the early decision that it was about transitioning all of our work. And actually, I have to say, we've got a great team of counsellors who retrained in many aspects in terms of working with people over telephone, and who quickly have become Zoom gurus or webcam gurus to be able to provide services. But I suppose one of the other things that we hadn't necessarily been doing up until then was more in the public communication sphere. So together with our team, we had developed a number of information resources about how we can have honest and open conversations with children about the uncertainty that's happening, how we can help children emotionally regulate. And most recently, at the start of September, we published a resource around supporting children with anxieties about returning to school. So that's been a really, I suppose, new arm of our work that's aimed in that sort of promoting resilience and giving people the information to be able to sort of look at the things that they can do themselves. I suppose apart from that as well, we've been working with colleagues in Inspire and wider across the sector with the COVID Wellbeing campaign that has been really a busy period over the summer and ongoing, which is again about just how we get some of those messages out in the public domain about the things that people can do themselves. So community care is absolutely essential, Kerry, and while it may have changed what it looks like, I think the fact that people need continued support, many organisations have been working to achieve that. In terms of just some of the challenges and opportunities, I think what we've really come across is an increased reliance, and what's come really sharply into focus is that digital divide. And when we would have talked about the digital divide before, we would have thought about it in terms of access to hardware, but actually, particularly in particular geographies across Northern Ireland, sometimes people don't even have internet connection, they don't have broadband. The cost of a broadband connection is prohibitive for them. So absolutely, digital divide is one of the key challenges, and that's been brought sharply into focus. But also in terms of the opportunities, we did some research in July and found that actually people have been reflecting really positively on their relationships as the busyness of life stripped out over the lockdown period. People have come to understand that what they were telling us was relationships with loved ones helped me get through the lockdown, and that they're planning to pay more attention to their personal relationships moving forward. And that's a really positive thing.
That's lovely to hear, Dwayne. That is a really positive point to move to Joanne on. I think that what you said, it's so evident, isn't it, when you're talking about children and things like that as well. And we've focused a lot on the older people within our community as well. COVID is so non-discriminatory. It's really impacted in every single aspect of community life, I think. And Joanne, how have you guys found that? You've also been part of the COVID Wellbeing work that Dwayne's referred to, that we've all been working collaboratively on, which has been a wonderful experience, I think, to do that and all pull together at this time as well. But how have you been finding this period of time?
Well, I mean, like, I suppose organisationally, like everybody else, we had to move to online really quickly, and we started to deliver some other work that we wouldn't normally do. I suppose before I go into that, I think the whole conversation around self-care is really, really interesting, and there's some conversation about it on Twitter that I think is really insightful at the minute. We do work in self-care, and it never really sits very easily with me. And the reason for that is because the general interpretation of self-care is one of personal responsibility. And yet we know that people who are most affected by the social determinants of health are people who are least likely to be in a position to take that personal responsibility. And it's not fair. It's not a fair ask. And what COVID did was not create that situation. It shone a spotlight on it that made it really, really hard to ignore. So that's the only real silver lining. Well, there's a few silver linings, but that's one of them that has come out of COVID. So I think when we talk about self-care, we're really, really careful to talk about it in the context of community care and the conditions that have to be in place for people to be able to take that responsibility for their own health and well-being. Quite often that's a goal that's just a step too far for people. So there was a couple of things that we did, a few things that we did. I'll reflect on two of them. We're a grant giver, so we wanted very, very quickly to provide some reassurance to those organisations that we fund, that we would continue to fund them, and that they were not under any pressure to deliver what they would normally be expected to deliver, that money would go towards their core costs. Because what we wanted was to see those smaller groups in particular that we would support to be able to continue to do what they were doing. Because we recognised that kind of, certainly March, April, May time, that was going to be invaluable. Quite often they were supporting really, really isolated people who were experiencing a lot of vulnerability at the time. So that was one thing that we did, and we did that with the support of the Health and Social Care Board, which was really brilliant for us to be able to do small amounts of money, but nonetheless a lifeline for some of those organisations. We coordinated the pharmacy delivery scheme. So Maura, you'll know the GAA, along with the other sporting organisations, the rural and urban transport associations, and all of those community groups across Northern Ireland gave of their time for free. We were able to provide some small contribution towards their running costs, but the kindness of people that we saw, phone calls that we received morning, noon and night to say, we're here, we're available, tell us what we can do, we want to help. So that was just fantastic. We ended up with the delivery of almost 63,000 prescriptions across Northern Ireland, and that was for people who just in many cases would have had no other way of getting vital medication. So it was a real, I think, return to community development roots, that people saw an issue and took it upon themselves to come up with a solution to it. And then finally, we saw very quickly the impact of information on people's health and well-being. We saw Facebook groups spring up out of nowhere. We saw WhatsApp groups spring up out of nowhere. Sometimes they were very helpful for people, and sometimes they weren't so helpful for people. There were lots of misinformation being shared and information that hadn't been fact-checked, and not in a malicious way. Just people were kind of struggling to make sense of what was happening, and were seeking information from wherever they could get it. So we partnered with Fact Check NI. Try saying that after, I'll not say, a couple of coffees. So we partnered with them, and we provided a number of fact-checked articles for people on topics that were of interest at the time. So around face coverings, around shielding, access to food. And when the stats came out around health inequalities, we did some articles on that as well. And they were really well received. Health literacy levels are low in Northern Ireland, as they are across the UK. So that means that for people living with complex conditions, medical and social, it's much more difficult for them to actually understand health related information. So it was really important for us that we were given out good information that was fact checked, but also it was health literate as well. We worked with an organisation in the Republic of Ireland called NALA, who had developed an A to Z. We took that and we set it in a Northern Ireland context, and we added lots to it. So that was kind of the key terms that people needed to know around COVID, and that was something that the Wellbeing Partnership shared on our behalf. Again, really well received. And we worked very closely with our membership, because information is good, but it has to be delivered in a particular way for it to have some resonance with people. So we use those community leaders, or at least we asked them if they would share information on our behalf, and they stepped up to the plate every time. So it's been a really challenging time. I think we are definitely going to see inequality gaps widen, and we are going to see inequality gaps that had remained static start to widen, and that's really troubling. I think the digital divide, we will see educational attainment issues in the not too distant future for many children who just did not have access to broadband, or were having to share it with other siblings or parents. That's going to be a huge issue, I think, you know, in the not too distant future as well. But every inequality, I think, is going to be impacted by COVID. People's access to employment, to good quality education, to an income that allows them to live a reasonable life, all of those things people are going to they are struggling with, and they're going to continue to struggle with. And we need to see the political will to take a collective approach to that. And that's something that we think is actually a huge opportunity in this, because we've seen our government start to work together really effectively in some instances. We've seen that they have the ability to reduce the bureaucracy that we all struggle with as organisations in the sector and leaders in the sector. And if they're able to do it in a pandemic, then they're able to do it after a pandemic as well. So lots of opportunity, I think, for that change to be embedded.
That's wonderful, Joanne. Thank you so much. There are loads of challenges, but I think through those challenges we've seen some of the best sides of our community spirit come out as well, haven't we? And speaking of that, Maura, I live with a man from Limerick, so I know the importance of the GAA. So and I'm just wondering, can you say a little bit? Obviously, you know, there was no games, there was no practice, all of those things. But what did the GAA do to channel their energies? They're known for being just part of the community and a real strength within the community. So what did you guys do in terms of channeling your energies during this time in March?
Well, I suppose like everyone at the start, it was a lot of scrambling around to see what was happening. So from mid-March, everything had closed down. So there was, you know, all activities, all games and that was closed, with no real idea of when they were likely to resume, if at all, this year. So immediately the response, and actually at club level, the response actually even kicked in before at an Ulster GA level. We had all our ducks in a row in terms of how we could safely support our communities and the community response to COVID. So, but again, that is what you were saying about clubs being embedded in the community. As soon as people weren't able to get out to their shops and pharmacies and all the rest, they were going and doing it straight away. You know, a neighbour was picking up the phone and calling someone who might need a bit of support or whatever. So, and the GA were very instrumental in coordinating that within their communities. Now, sometimes it was a community-led, or sorry, a GA club-led response, but probably on most occasions it was a culmination of several entities within a community, and it was really the church groups coming together, schools, you know, anyone who had a bit of influence who they could make contacts with and network with, and the GA was very much a part of that as well. You know, Joanne spoke about the pharmacy programme, and yeah, wherever we could help, we were trying to do that. And again, I think it came down to the fact that our volunteers are naturally very active, our players are naturally very active, and when all of this, you know, their GA normal activity was taken out of their daily schedule, they were wanting to do something. So, and we do have good governance, we do have a good, you know, network of people that can spring into action very, very quickly, which I think is what happened. So a lot of our time then, in terms of being Ulster GA or even supporting our counties, was around just making sure that what we were seeing clubs do, that it was safe to do so, in terms of obviously COVID and all of that, but also in terms of safeguarding and all of that was very, very important too. So we work very closely with obviously the PHA and HSE in the south, with the likes of Joanne's organisation, wherever we could get the support, whether it was local council or whatever. just to make sure that what we were doing was correct and how we were supporting our clubs. And I think going back to what both Dwayne and Joanna said, the online thing became very important. We developed a COVID microsite, and again, it was exactly what Joanne was saying there about making sure anything that we were putting up there was the fact-checked authority, you know, that we were using their information just to keep people, I suppose, informed. And it was very much to do with using a lot of the information that groups were providing and us simply saying, can we also share this? And they were delighted that we would share it on our platforms, because I suppose everybody does get their information in different places and it resonates with people in different ways depending on who's telling them it. So we found that actually very, very good, and it was great in terms of clubs had a point to go to straight away to get their questions answered, because it was a very, as everyone probably can attest to, it was a very busy time. It was every day it was changing, even within the morning and the afternoon, what we were telling clubs may have changed. So it was a good way of keeping people up to date in those, particularly in those couple of weeks, you know, the end of March, April into May, before things maybe settled down a wee bit again. So thankfully, of course, we've returned to GA activity from July time, the end of July. We've been able to get back out and going again. So, and to be honest, it's been a huge relief for people to get back out playing, just around that social connections that they missed so much during the summer. And you probably look forward to playing mostly in the good weather in the summertime and all that. And I suppose the good weather was happening. Everybody was pent up at home, couldn't get out. So it was great that we were just so thankful that we were able to get back out and get playing and getting some kind of normality as well.
Oh, that's brilliant, Maura. Oh, that's great, Maura. Yeah, we look forward to seeing more of the games coming up now. Anyway, well, some more than others, of course, but
yeah. Fingers crossed, it all goes ahead.
Absolutely. Karen, now obviously with Inspire, we were really keen early on to say that some of our buildings might be closed, but our services were certainly open to support people from the very get-go. Could you outline a little bit about how you and some of our community wellbeing schemes have approached supporting people during this period of time as well, and what have been the biggest challenges maybe from a mental health perspective as you've seen them?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. Yes, I mean, certainly linking in with what Dwayne and Joanna have said, you know, we found straight from the get-go we had to start changing our service delivery and try and be creative with what we were going to do, because community wellbeing services are throughout the whole of the province, and we're working with over 800 people through those services. So 800 people potentially with mental health problems in lockdown situation and being cut off from services was not a good scenario at all. And certainly we work with some very vulnerable individuals. And so we had to change. We had to think very quickly about how can we best meet the needs of the individuals accessing the services. And whilst the doors of the buildings, as you said, Kerry, were closed, we very much were up and run in business. And, you know, we were very lucky. We have very creative staff and we have very good partner organisations who were willing to come in and help out right from the get-go. So we moved quickly to developing a virtual platform. All of our services moved in that way. We had two key areas: the virtual platforms where we used Zoom, Facebook, Teams, WhatsApp, and also the telephone. And the whole remit was to make sure that contact was there on a daily basis with individuals, so they weren't feeling so socially isolated, so that they weren't feeling as if the world didn't care, because ultimately they were left in a situation where they didn't have access to services. There were no mental health professionals in contact, and tragically for those who had family, that they couldn't access family either. So we became everybody's family, their services, and the outside world to them. And we found that through developing those areas, the virtual world, and also through the telephone contact, we became more and more responsive and more in tune with what the needs, particularly for the individuals and also for the community, were. So we moved to do things like get involved with the food banks, not just in the community wellbeing services, support the individuals as they would have in schemes. They also branched out. They got involved with food banks. We got involved with local suppliers. We became delivery people, delivering essentials to the individuals who couldn't get out and those who were most socially isolated. We had staff who went and done drop-offs at doors, stood and talked to them over the fence or in through the window, waving, just so that people could see another individual, that they had a friendly face. And that's so important, being able to connect with somebody who you're used to seeing, and then suddenly your world's cut off from even seeing that individual. So there was a lot of that work went on the ground. And one of the big things also was the wellbeing packs that services put together and delivered out, not just to those service users in schemes, but also to other individuals who were isolated in the community on their own, who maybe another organisation had contacted us to say, you know, this individual's on their own. I don't think they're doing too well. We're worried about them. Would you be able to provide them some support? So community wellbeing services really did open their doors in a virtual way, and also in a face-to-face way to other individuals, not just those who are on the books. It was to everybody in the community, and that was the big thing for us, that we weren't seen as just a very singular type of service, that we were encompassing for everybody and trying to encourage anybody who needed the support to get in touch, because that was so important. And we found that there were lots of individuals who hadn't access to services that they should have. Even through lockdown, they maybe didn't have contact with their doctor, they didn't have contact with their community mental health team, they didn't have contact with anybody else. And so we did become a lifeline for them. And certainly, you know, from feedback from service users and individuals who access support, we have found that, and certainly community groups have come on board quite a bit. So not just within community wellbeing, but also in our addiction services too, Kerry, there has been a whole branching out of support and services being provided for those who maybe didn't know Addiction NI before, or didn't know community wellbeing services before, and then family support and floating support as well. So the whole family within Inspire, really on the ground, started to encompass quite a wide range of support and care for individuals who are out there. And we're still doing it. We're going through quite a difficult time at the minute. Again, it feels like we're on a roller coaster. I'm not sure which roller coaster. I don't think it's the Hulk. I wouldn't want to take that one on, but it's certainly a pandemic roller coaster. And again, we have to think very quickly on our feet. We have to put things into action. And the brilliant thing is that the people who are delivering that on the ground are just amazing. They are so compassionate. They're so kind. They have just embraced everything. Looking after some of their own needs, but putting the needs of others really up there. And they're trying now, as we speak, to think of a new way of normality for the next 6 months, never mind what they've been through. So a lot of what we've learned from the last 6 months, we are continuing on with. The virtual platforms will continue because they've been so good and they've been so inclusive. Some of our community wellbeing services, you know, they're doing yoga, they're doing online cooking groups. Some of our staff have become local celebrities in the area because other people have asked to access some of those things. And yeah, you know, they've had mothers and their children join in some of the cookery classes online, and they've just broke the monotony of lockdown. And so a lot of that will continue. And yes, whilst we've been back in a small measured way to some face-to-face work, we will continue to do what we can. Social distance and walking. When you talk about the 5 steps to wellbeing, I think we've encompassed them all and continued it. You know, anywhere is a good location to run a group or to meet somebody. That's the beauty of what we can do. And as a society, you know, our community wellbeing services could not have done what we've done without the support from other partner organisations and other individuals out in the community. And it's great to see that community spirit really taking hold.
That's wonderful, Karen. I have to say, I mean, I'm sure other organisations who are service delivery organisations as well, like would just, when we're having this conversation, it would be really important to acknowledge those people who work in our services who have just completely gone the extra mile. They always do, but in a scenario like this where people were worried about potentially their own health, their family's health, all of those sorts of things, and still they were out there, they were going into residential services each day and providing support. They were getting out into the community to make sure that people did see that and have that face-to-face contact, even albeit from a distance or over a wall. The fact that people really did put others before themselves, I think, is just a really wonderful thing, and people did go above and beyond. And I know that we're incredibly grateful within Inspire to our staff, but I'm sure other people feel exactly the same way. It's been wonderful to hear the stories of support. And Siobhan, I suppose now in your new role as interim mental health commissioner, you'll be being bombarded by us all. But I suppose stepping back and thinking more generally, you know, about how COVID has affected the way we connect with and look after one another, what do you think we should be doing now about trying to harness that and continue that approach in the wake of COVID? You know, we've heard such wonderful stuff on from the different panelists today. I suppose, is there some things you think we should really be thinking about how we maintain this strong sense of connectedness in the wake of COVID?
Yeah, Kerry, that's a really, really good question. I think as a population in Northern Ireland, we were in many ways divided, and we've come through a long history of violence and trauma and struggle. So COVID-19 actually is not, you know, in terms of what we've been through, it's not the first time we've had to endure hardship, and arguably we've had worse hardships before, and our parents and grandparents would have endured worse. So I think we need to keep remembering that we are a really resilient population. I think one of the things we saw, particularly in the early stages, is that all of the different communities had this sense of togetherness and support and respect for the workers who were keeping the food on the supermarket shelves, with the healthcare workers particularly. I think that was enormously valuable, and it really allowed us to reorientate and refocus and think about our core values and what's really, really important. And we're now seeing that hopefully our teachers and childminders are respected in a way that maybe they weren't before. I think all of that is really powerful. And then we were united against this kind of common enemy in COVID and this virus. And in order to fight the enemy, we were really required to connect, to protect each other, and as a sort of a pack, as a population, we had to come together and do things for vulnerable people, and everybody had a role to play, and I thought that was absolutely amazing. So I think we need to retain that focus. The concern is now that we're starting to get a little bit more divided now. Mental health has been used by sections of the population who are sceptical about the government's approach. And I think that's really, really worrying. I mean, we don't want to stifle healthy debate in any way, but I think it's just important to know that we all want the same outcome, and that means balancing different risks, and it means helping people, protecting people's mental health whilst at the same time fighting the virus. It's a really difficult and complicated message to get across, but it's absolutely essential that we remain united and we remain behind the leaders who are following the scientists and taking the advice, and that changes all the time. So I think that's one of the big problems that we're starting to see right now. But I think in a way the old divisions have become less important, and we need to try and retain that focus and think about how we can retain that respect and that sense of, you know, what's really important in life. How do we get that back? How do we retain that, and how do we take the things that we've learned through the pandemic? For me, it's about learning that exercise is really important, that commuting, we don't have to do so much of that, that we can do a lot of things online and virtually, and actually things like Wi-Fi access and access to technology are our lifelines, and we need to make sure that we prioritize those. So there are many lists that are being developed right now that will help us as we go forward reorientate and refocus on what's actually really, really important. I think families, relationships, those sort of more vulnerable members of our population, I think we're seeing them in a completely different way now as a population, and that's really, really good. And I think just that thing of our common humanity, and the randomness of life, and we really don't know who's going to get this virus and what way it's going to affect them. So that is a great leveler, and that has broken down a lot of barriers, I think. But then again, we still have those many inequalities that existed before COVID, and we're seeing now that they're being amplified by this virus as well. So kids that don't have access to technology or outdoor play spaces are really going to be disadvantaged here. So I guess it's just about reminding us of our values and what's really, really important in life. And I think it's taught me certainly a lot about my own biological stress response and how I managed in those early days. I think we have a lot to learn there. And whilst I know a bit about this, it really took me by surprise how much it affected me and how difficult it was whenever my support structures were taken away as a single parent. And there's a lot of data actually showing that even groups who are very privileged, whenever their social support networks were taken away, they really, really struggled, and that led to anxiety and mental health problems and all sorts of things. So we're all learning through this, but I think we need to retain that sense of totogetherness and that sense of community and remind ourselves what's really important now as the divisions are starting to show.
Thanks, Siobhan. I totally agree, and I suppose one of the things that emerged probably really just before lockdown, but became much stronger, was that concept of be kind, wasn't it? And we were hashtagging be kind. How, like, I suppose now I suppose opening this up a wee bit wider to the panel, and you've started to touch on that, Siobhan. How do we continue to maintain that ethos, do you think? Like, how do we continue to nurture that concept of being kind? There's stories at the minute, about particular groups being pointed out as maybe being irresponsible and other groups feeling more vulnerable. So how do we in our jobs and in our roles continue to try to nurture that idea of be kind? Like, Dwayne, maybe what do you think about some of those challenges might be, in terms of that?
And actually, I think people have already talked about what those things are. I think how we do it is continuing to encourage community action. And actually, some of it has really sprung up organically and hasn't required a structure, but actually, there's a lot of it. We have a community and voluntary sector here in Northern Ireland that does amazing things, and that has kind of, the last 10 years of funding has undermined some of the stability of that. So I think there's a really important discussion about what are the pieces and the structures that we need to continue to encourage community action. And I think there's just, in that community action, there's the discussions. What has been really, I think what has begun to emerge in a way that we haven't seen before is the debate about inequalities and actually what they mean on a practical level. In many parts of my world, actually, we don't have enough data or enough quality data to be able to focus on who is struggling, who needs support, and what does that look like. So I think there's a wider discussion at a societal level about how we can really embed that work on inequalities in a meaningful way that then allows communities to take action. So yeah, I think there's a particular point for children in and around connectedness as well that I think we all have to respond to, and that is around the fact that inherently we're social animals. And the last 6 months has been really counterintuitive. We've seen other people as a potential threat, and we're managing that threat by locking down into our households. And adults can, for the most part, get their heads around that. But actually, as children's brains are being hardwired, I think it's really counterintuitive. So I think there's something really important that's in the connectedness space, and that mirrors the be kind, which is how do we have really age-appropriate, open, honest discussions with our children to help them pick and make sense out of what it is. So yeah, I think the action has sprung up organically, and I think social media has been brilliant at shining a light on it so that everybody can see and it inspires others. But I think if we're serious about it moving forward, It's how do we fully understand the inequalities debate, and how do we fully put in place a structure that allows that community action to flourish.
That's great, Dwayne. Yeah, the issue around the children, I suppose children being back to school now, and how we engage and support teachers as well around that, because there's probably going to be so many challenges, isn't there, as well, from that perspective. Maura, yourself as well, like, is there things that you think we should be encouraging our devolved and local government to do, really, in terms of using that sort of community spirit we have in our sporting communities to help continue that sort of connectedness?
Yeah, well, I think in fairness, this whole COVID has really shone a light on that community voluntary sector and how valuable those people were in actually being the first responders to the need. By the time, as organisations, we get ourselves right, and governance, there's more red tape placed at our door than there is just on a person in the community who's concerned about someone and is willing to volunteer to do something. We were nearly behind the curve, I feel. The work was being done while we were catching up to say, okay, is this right or wrong? So I think in terms of how funding is administered in the future, and I hate always harping on about funding, but those small pots of money that even Joanne was chatting about, they really did keep clubs activity going for those couple of weeks, that maybe small costs that they were incurring just as part of the community response. And a lot of the time they will never want compensated back for that or anything like that, but there was obviously still demands around keeping facilities able to be used once things happened again and so on. So a lot of the funding, I thought it was great, and the way it was very, very flexible in terms of what they were asking for the recipient to do with that money and how it was to be spent and how you report on that. That took off an awful lot of bureaucracy on the behalf of the volunteer that sometimes would be off-putting, but certainly in a space when we were frantically trying to respond to the needs of the community around COVID, it just took off that pressure in terms of getting funding and things like that. Now, a lot of this work goes on without funding, granted, but it's a kicking it down the road kind of scenario whereby, yes, we're prepared to do this for now, but we can't keep doing this indefinitely unless we're supported some way financially and all the rest. So I think that was great. And also in terms of it allowed clubs to do what it was that suited the needs of their community. They knew what their community wanted because they've their finger on the pulse essentially. Whereas sometimes the way grants and that can be administered, particularly from government straight to the user, there's an awful lot of stipulations, restrictions. You're having to do it in a way in which they want you to do it, and sometimes you're trying to do your own activity but having to do it slightly different in a way that you to concentrating on funding. The NHS, clapping for the NHS, and I know there's a lot, cynical in terms of that all needs to be backed up now by policy and so on. If we're going to genuinely respect and value the people who were really keeping the country going while all this was happening, well then it needs to be embedded in policy and not just short-term funds of money, but place a real value on it going forward into the future. And I think particularly around sport and so on, that's obviously my area for passion and all the rest, but we have such an ability to do things like the community development approach around health and well-being, your mental health, all of these things is so important. And I think it's not that we're crying out saying we need more than others. It's not about that. It's just about valuing what it's been going on for decades, centuries, in terms of what the sport and these community organisations do, and that when things do get tight and budgets have to be looked at again, that it's not the sector that's the first to be cut, which we find a lot of the time is. But I think obviously it has shone a light too then on the fact that our education system, our health system, all of that is so important. And we need to be using what we can do to take the pressure off in terms of that, like the health sector and so on. If there's anything the GA can be doing to improve health and well-being, we'll do that, and really value that has a knock-on effect down the line in terms of health improvement and so on. So that'll be some of the key things I would think.
It's interesting to hear you say that, Maura, as well. It's like one of the things around COVID that struck me as well is that we sometimes, you've just touched on it already around funding, we can take a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach to things, and it can be very black and white, whereas the thing about heading into COVID is there was an awful lot more flexibility, and that's one of the things I think we'd all agree we'd love to see a bit more of moving forward, and also that sense of collaboration, and not losing sight of that and just going back into our own little ways of working. And I suppose one of the things that's very, very close to my heart that you've touched on as well is the dialogue pre-COVID. We might remember there was a lot of dialogue around unskilled workers, people being called unskilled workers, and people's freedom of movement and things like that. And I think what COVID did was really turn that debate on its head, and maybe taught us that those unskilled workers are the people that were keeping us going through that really, really challenging time. And I would agree with you that we'd love to see that being properly recognised in policy moving forward. I don't know how other panellists might feel about that as well. Did somebody want to come in there?
I can come
Siobhan,
in there.
please, that'd be great.
No, you're completely right. I mean, the very idea that anybody's an unskilled worker. I was dealing with students. One student in particular was working in a care home, and I remember just being so grateful, and my attitude to her work and everything changed because I knew that she was managing this and taking on extra shifts and looking after people who were quite vulnerable at the same time as she was doing her final year project. And it just really made me think of all the roles that our students have in addition to their life as a student and their work as a student, and how powerless I felt in terms of the whole pandemic, and she was out there doing things. So I think that's a really, really important message. The other thing that's coming across really strongly is that community and voluntary groups that work on the ground, they know what's needed in their own communities, and we really need to be trusting them and just asking them, well, what do you need this money for, and giving them that flexibility. And that's something that I would like to see now taken forward, that we would have less paperwork and less control, or less of the kind of the tick boxes that you need to do it this way and that way, that actually the groups know what works in their own community. So let's trust them a little bit more and actually give them the funding that's needed, because the insights that they have are so valuable, and there's just such a big gap between the people who are making the decisions, the people who are in power, and those who are working on the ground. And this is really showing that, I think, in a really important way. And one of the things I'm doing right now at the minute as mental health champion is talking to those groups and making sure that I not just talk but listen to what, because they really know what's happening here, and they will be able to tell us very, very quickly what the trends are in their areas and what the issues are, and so that we can respond to those. So I think that those are things that we really need to take forward now and to maintain as we head, and particularly as we head into the winter, because it's going to be a lot more complex now as we're dealing with different levels of virus in different communities and different types of responses to. We really need to listen to those groups on the ground and fund them appropriately and make sure that that's flexible.
Siobhan, I was actually going to ask you, well, you're here in your new role, so partly that answers this, but maybe just, do you think that the mental health priorities have been altered now for the executive, really, by the events of the last 6 months?
I think mental health was always a really, really important priority for the executive. I think it's shifted slightly in that the groups that we're now looking at that are at risk or vulnerable have changed somewhat. We know that people who are shielding, for example, that's a group that might have mental health issues as a result of the isolation that is nearly required right now. And also we know that there are other groups who've been exposed to the virus, and we don't know what the neurological long-term effects of the virus are, so we're concerned about that as well. But ultimately, I think when you look at the inequalities, we can see that people who lived in deprived areas, who are in low-paid jobs, whose jobs are at risk now, those are the people who will have mental health problems, and those are the people that we're concerned about in terms of suicidal behaviour going forward. So there's an important message there for those people who are looking after the welfare benefits, who are thinking about whether the furlough scheme should be extended. I mean, it really should be, because protecting jobs and protecting people's livelihoods and making sure that we don't plunge people into destitution, that's so important in terms of mental health. But mental health has been a huge priority for a long time for all of the political parties here. And, you know, I've been in this job for just over a month now, and everything I've asked for, I've received. The support has been incredible. The information that they've given me, if I need any data, any figures, they come straight away, and they're so willing to work with me to make sure that our strategy is for a mental health service that's world leading. So, and that's what we're trying. That's what we're trying to do. So I'm really impressed actually with what I've seen so far. And if I wasn't, because it is an independent post, and I can you know, say whatever I want and be paid for from all of the departments, not just health. So honestly, it's been really, really good, and the will is there, and people do care about this issue.
I think sorry, go on, Dwayne.
Carrie, if I can just, I'm back to the core question you were talking about there, that idea of, you know, unskilled workers have now become our key workers and supported our, and I think there's something there that we need to keep in mind as we start to come out of COVID. In our experience, particularly in terms of frontline workers, we have experience and are talking to people, doctors, nurses who have moved out of their family home for 3 or 4 months because they're working in areas with COVID infection. And you know, we think about the intense traumatic experience that potentially is for those people. We also have to understand that has a wider impact on the family system as well, you know, on partners, on children, and that, you know, that sight of that is not lost as we come up with plans to ensure that people have access to services, and as we seek to understand what impact that traumatic experience has, not only on the people who are working at the front line, but on their family systems around them. So I think that's a really important point to keep sight of.
Absolutely. You're sort of making me think about changing my question, drawing this to an end. We're coming close to the end of our time, and I was going to ask a different question, but I think I'll ask this, and I'm going to give you all a challenge. In 30 seconds, can you say what you would like from a mental health perspective to see prioritised in the next 6 months, given that we're still living with COVID, and given that we are just living with a changeable environment all of the time, and new challenges, but also we've got learning from some of the things that have gone before, so there might also be new opportunities. So maybe just if each of our panelists could tell us what they would like to see prioritised in the incoming 6 months. And now I'm going to put you on the spot. Joanne, what about you?
Carrie, I was just about to write it down for myself so I wouldn't forget. I've reached that stage in my life, unfortunately, where everything has to be written down. I mean, years ago, I worked in children's services, and I learned a really important lesson there. And it was that you've got to adopt a conscious belief that people want the best for themselves, their families, and their community. And it sounds like a really easy thing to do, but we can become quite cynical. So adopting that conscious belief, I think, is really, really important. And we've seen that in buckets during COVID. So I would love to see that maintained, but not just that, right? Dwayne, you said something really important. We don't have good data in Northern Ireland when it comes to understanding inequality and knowing what's the right action to take. So there's a responsibility there on government, but on local communities as well, to ask for that data and to make sure that it's provided. And that data has to move beyond the normal statistical data that we have, because that only gives part of the picture. It has to be looked at alongside the tacit knowledge that communities have, the insights that they can provide us with, that we've all reflected on this morning. And we have so many of those insights, but quite often they're seen as something that's an add-on, nice to have. It's not. It's absolutely core to how we understand and take action on these really, really critical issues that we're facing into. So it has to be given the same standing as the statistical data, and that means that it has to be gathered, it has to be valued, and has to be analysed correctly. And I think if that can be done, the relationship between government and our sector then needs to change. It needs to be less master-servant, grant-giver-recipient, and it needs to be something that's much more equal and reciprocal, and something that does give, as Siobhan has rightly said, communities the ability to take that action, that collective action, identify what's important to them, and then take the action that's most appropriate for that community. So just some small asks, you know, totally achievable in the next 6 months. Why not?
Exactly, why not indeed. Karen, what about you?
Hi, Kerry. I think I would echo some of what Joanne is saying there. Certainly, I do think there is a need for services and community organisations to be better funded, certainly looked at in the concept of what's happening, and to be an easier path to be able to get that funding as well. We don't want to see the return to draconian measures, but unfortunately that's probably going to be part of the equation. And another thing I'd like to see, the whole end of the research, looking also at the effect on the staff and the likes of vicarious trauma. Compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma is something that is going to come part and parcel throughout this pandemic, and we have to look after the individuals who are providing all of that care and their families, and we have a duty to do that. And I think everybody as a collective has a duty to do that. You know, the whole thing around kindness starts with being kind to yourself. And if you can't see your own needs, or you don't realise how are you going to be kind? And I think it's very important that we protect everybody as much as we possibly can. So I think going forward, I think there needs to be a bit of both workings and in organisations, because there's so many people want to help. There's so many people who have put themselves on the line. There's so many people who have went the extra mile, and they have to be protected too. And it's about helping them to see that they need to be protected and supported with this. So maybe some things of how we support staff needs to change. I think there's an element of looking at how we support staff and how we support community workers and what can we do for them, because we are in a very restrictive position with regards to face-to-face contact and all of that. But how much time do we actually give people on the ground? You know, listening isn't a big request, but yet through this whole experience, I don't know if we've listened that much, and I think we have to do more listening moving forward.
Lovely, Karen, thank you. And Maura, yourself, any final thoughts around what the next 6 months holds?
Yeah, I suppose from our point of view, what I would be hoping is that a lot of those connections that have been made within communities through the COVID response, that those can be maintained and nurtured coming into, you know, the winter and into next year as well. We had, you know, our groups have reached out to each other in probably ways they've never had to do it before. And I think, you know, they've created loads of different, you know, new relationships that traditionally possibly would never have occurred in communities. But that's now there, and it's just about harnessing that and bringing that forward into, you know, after COVID, that those can still, it's not just COVID that's brought us together. We can still have those relationships and those connections after COVID and really use them to serve our communities better, because yes, funding and all of that is maybe an issue for some, but when we work together, we get so much more done. We get so much more bang for our buck. So it just makes sense that we keep those connections going and not do it for any other reason than just being kind to each other and looking out for each other, and I suppose taking pride in the fact that this is our community, so we stand up and we look after each other.
That's great, Maura. Thank you so much. And Dwayne, yourself?
What everybody else has said, number one, and particularly the data point, because I think disaggregated data is so essential. From my perspective, I do think that one of the big risks that we face is a potential disproportionate impact on children and young people. And I think, you know, when we look at particularly in secondary education, people have access to counselling as a statutory sort of right, and that's not there for primary school children. I think, you know, the earlier we can support people on some of these issues, it's not a 6-month action, Kerry, is the honesty of it, but I think we need to have an honest and mature discussion about that.
Yeah, totally agree. And Siobhan?
My one is about young people and children. I think we really need to prioritise their needs moving forward as we learn to live with this virus for the next few years. We're talking about a critical period in their development, and 6 months, a year, 2 years is actually really, really crucial in terms of how they form relationships and how their brain is developing and how they grow up to manage stress. So I think we need to really prioritise the response for young people and children and make sure that they don't need to take extended periods away from school and away from childcare, and that young people with additional difficulties and special needs have access to the interventions that are actually life-changing as they move into adulthood. So that would be what I would do. But of course, what everybody else has said is absolutely vital as well, particularly around inequalities, statistics, and bringing people together and remembering that. Thanks.
That's lovely, thank you. Well, listen, we've pretty much used our allotted time, but I have to say I've really enjoyed this conversation because, you know, we have come through a really, really challenging time, but in actual fact, the conversation today, whilst talking about those challenges, is also talking about a lot of hope as well, and there's obviously a lot of passion from the panelists involved as well. So from my perspective, I've really enjoyed that. We've touched just on the end there on some things about the value that we need to place on data. We've talked over and over throughout this conversation about collaboration and innovation. We've talked about collective action. We've talked about flexibility and maintaining our approach to flexibility around funding. We've talked about looking after our key workers and our staff. We've talked about nurturing our community connections, remembering our children and our young people, and addressing inequalities and looking after the vulnerable. So I think we've talked about a lot of things in just this last hour. So I want to take the opportunity to say a very big thank you to the panelists, and thank you for being so open and talking about your experiences. I also want to thank everybody who's watching from home, and I'd really encourage people to visit Inspire's Twitter and Facebook pages just to look at what else is going on around the wellbeing sessions for the day. And all that really remains for me to say is to say thank you, be kind, stay safe, all the best.